Let's walk into the lively world of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. The journey begins at the Tabard Inn in Southwark, a bustling location famous not just for Chaucer's pilgrims but also for London's playhouses. Here, 29 pilgrims meet, and when Chaucer himself joins, the group becomes 30. And this confusing number of pilgrims had been asked in exam many times. So understand this, 29 pilgrims plus Chaucer himself, and that makes total of 30 pilgrims. Their host at the inn, Harry Bailly, proposes a contest to pass the time on their way to Canterbury. Each pilgrim is to tell 4 stories, 2 on the way, 2 on the return. The teller of the best tale will win a free supper, paid for by the rest. This ambitious plan would have produced 128 tales in total, but Chaucer wrote only 24. And here's a fact you must hold on to. In reality, only 23 pilgrims actually tell stories and only 24 tales survive. This also had been asked in exam. The first tale comes from the knight, his long romance of Palamon and Arcite. But Chaucer, ever playful, also mocks his own storytelling. Remember the tale of Sir Thopas? It's deliberately bad, and the host interrupts him, asking him to stop. The tales themselves are wonderfully varied. They are written in both prose and verse of different meters asked in exam. They range from love stories and legends to satire and moral fables, each one prefaced with lively prologues, punctuated by interruptions and often concluded with epilogues. Together, they turn into a tapestry of medieval life. Now, the general prologue is where we meet the pilgrims. Chaucer paints vivid character sketches, the knight, the prioress, the wife of Bath, the pardoner, and so many others, making them some of the most memorable portraits in English literature. Short links or dramatic scenes tie the tales together, giving the whole journey a theatrical, almost play-like quality. Though Chaucer left the work incomplete, the return journey never written, he closes with a humble farewell to his readers. In doing so, he secured his place as the first great English short storyteller and poet. So, to fix in memory, 30 pilgrims at the Tabard Inn, only 24 tales written instead of the planned 128, prose and verse mixed, and 23 pilgrims actually telling the stories. That's the essence of Chaucer's great storytelling project. We begin Chaucer's Canterbury Tales with the most famous opening lines of Middle English poetry. When April, with its sweet showers, has pierced the drought of March to the root. And this line has been asked in exam. The famous line, April is the cruelest month, was written by Eliot in his poem, The Waste Land. Chaucer, in contrast, celebrates April as a restorative month of new life in the opening of the Canterbury Tales. Eliot's line subverts Chaucer's positive portrayal of April, as Eliot's April stirs difficult memories and desire, creating a mood of spiritual and cultural collapse rather than rebirth. These lines set the stage for springtime renewal, when pilgrims, stirred by both devotion and adventure, set out for Canterbury to visit the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. Our narrator Chaucer himself steps forward as a friendly, gregarious, and almost naive observer, ready to describe each fellow traveller in detail. The tone is both vivid and social, as though he is chatting with us directly. Next comes the host, Harry Bailly, jovial, commanding, and quick-tempered, and his name was featured in the exam. He will soon become the leader of the group, organizing the tale-telling contest and keeping the pilgrims in good humor during the long journey. Then Chaucer turns to the figure of highest rank, the knight. He is presented as the very model of medieval chivalry, brave, loyal, honorable, and deeply committed to the code of truth, honor, freedom, and courtesy. Chaucer writes, "A knight there was, and that a worthy man, who from the time that he first began to ride out, he loved chivalry, truth and honor, freedom and courtesy." These lines was asked in exam. The knight has fought across Christendom and heathen lands alike, Prussia, Lithuania, Russia, Granada, Alexandria, and even in the Great Sea at Satalia. His record is unmatched, and yet Chaucer praises him not only for his victories but for his humility and dedication. Riding with the knight is his son, the squire, young, handsome, and full of courtly energy. Chaucer describes him simply but memorably. With him there was his son, a young squire, a lover, and a lively bachelor. He represents youth, desire, and the playful side of courtly tradition, already trained for battle but far more enamored with love and poetry. Next, Chaucer sketches the yeoman, the knight's loyal servant. He is practical, well-equipped, and carries the look of a forester. His role reminds us that even the greatest knight needs the service of loyal attendants to sustain his way of life, the prioress aka Madame Eglantine. Now let us turn to one of Chaucer's most delicately drawn characters, the prioress, Madame Eglantine, a nun whose modesty, courtly manners, and tender heart make her stand out on the pilgrimage. Chaucer begins with a gentle description. There was also a nun, a prioress, who was very simple and modest in her smiling. Her greatest oath was but by Saint Loy, and she was called Madame Eglantine, and these lines had been asked in exam. The prioress is marked by her dainty speech and elegant manners. Chaucer tells us she sang the divine service well, tuning it in her nose very elegantly, and she spoke French very properly. According to the school of Stratford at Bow, for the French of Paris was unknown to her, again asked in exam. This small detail, her French learned at Stratford at Bow rather than in Paris, hints at her provincial sophistication, another classic exam anchor. Her table manners received the poet's most careful attention, underscoring her aspiration to aristocratic refinement. Chaucer notes, at table she was well taught with everything. She let no morsel fall from her lips, nor dipped her fingers too deep in the sauce. She could carry a morsel well and carefully, that no drop fell on her breast. In courtesy, she took great pleasure. She wiped her upper lip so clean that in her cup there was no trace of grease when she had drunk her draught. Again asked in exam. Yet beneath this polish, Chaucer emphasizes her tender conscience and compassion. He observes, she was so charitable and so compassionate, she would weep if she saw a mouse caught in a trap, whether it were dead or bleeding. Again asked in the exam. This detail demonstrates her sensitive nature, almost exaggerated in its pity for animals. Similarly, her affection for her small dogs, feeding them roasted meat, milk, and fine bread, and weeping bitterly if one died or was beaten, reveals a heart that translates religious compassion into personal sentiment. She strives to imitate courtly manners, to appear dignified, and to embody refinement. Yet Chaucer also invites us to see the contrast between her role as a nun and her preoccupation with manners, pets, and aristocratic elegance. Accompanying her is a second nun and 3 priests, one of whom is a famous nun's priest whose tale we later hear. Let's move on to 2 of Chaucer's most colourful portraits from the Canterbury Tales, the worldly monk and the merry friar. First, the monk. Chaucer describes him as no ordinary cloistered figure, but a man deeply attached to the pleasures of the world. Instead of following the strict monastic rules of Saint Benedict or Saint Maurice, he chose, as Chaucer tells us, to let old things pass and follow the modern world at his own pace. This monk is a hunter, a man who prefers riding with swift greyhounds to sitting over books in the cloister. His sleeves are trimmed with the finest fur, and a golden pin with a love knot secures his hood, all signs of luxury and wealth. Far from the ideal of monastic poverty, this figure symbolizes the corruption of the religious orders, a monk more abbot-like in pride than in piety. Now the friar, whose name we are told is Hubert, and yes, note this carefully, there was a friar, a wanton and merry fellow, and his descriptions have been asked in exam. Chaucer paints him as a jovial, charming and utterly corrupt religious figure. He arranges marriages for young women, claims a greater power of confession than a parish priest, and is quick to offer pleasant absolution for those who can pay. And here is another exam marker. Chaucer tells us he was an easy man to give penance. It was asked in exam, especially when he knew he would get a good meal in return. The friar's corruption runs deeper. Chaucer notes how he enriched himself through begging, describing him as the best beggar in his house. For though a widow had not a shoe, yet he would have a farthing before he went. Again asked in exam. His cheerful voice in reciting in principio made him persuasive, but his income always outweighed his rent, another sign of greed and manipulation. Chaucer further underlines his worldliness with a vivid detail. His eyes twinkled in his head aright, as do the stars in the frosty night. Well, this was also asked in exam. This final image perfectly captures his playful yet untrustworthy charm. Together, the monk and the friar reflect Chaucer's biting satire of the medieval church. The monk symbolizes luxurious neglect of spiritual duty, while the friar embodies the commercialization of confession and piety. Both stand as enduring examples of Chaucer's genius in blending humor, realism, and social critique. Next on Chaucer's pilgrimage comes the merchant. He is wealthy, pompous, and obsessed with profit. Chaucer paints him with a forked beard, riding high on his horse, wearing a multicolored coat. The portrait signals both his prosperity and his concern with appearances. Then we meet the clerk of Oxford, a poor but virtuous student of philosophy. Though he owns little, he treasures 20 books bound in black or red, it was once asked in exam, all devoted to Aristotle and philosophy, again asked in exam. Chaucer tells us his speech is always filled with moral virtue, and he would gladly learn and gladly teach. He becomes the embodiment of knowledge pursued for wisdom's sake, not wealth. Next is the man of law, or sergeant of law. A learned and successful lawyer, he is exact in his work and rich in knowledge of statutes. But Chaucer shifts quickly to describe the franklin, who travels in the same company. His beard is white as a daisy, his nature sanguine, and his love of wine and feasting shows him to be Epicurus's own son. He lives in pleasure, is often knight of the shire, has been both sheriff and county auditor, and always carries a dagger with a silk purse at his belt. Above all, Chaucer notes there was no such worthy landowner anywhere. We then see the guildsmen 5 skilled craftsmen, a haberdasher, a carpenter, a weaver, a dyer, and a tapestry maker. Dressed in the same livery, their unity reflects the rising middle class. Chaucer even suggests their wives enjoy the title of Madam, showing their social ambition. Alongside them is Roger, the cook, known for his culinary skills but marred by a crusty sore on his leg. The detail blends talent with grotesque realism. Next we have the shipman. Rough, experienced, and well-travelled, he knows every tide, harbour and chart. Yet Chaucer adds a darker touch. He is something of a rogue, quick to take advantage at sea. Next, the physician. He is a learned man, well-versed in the great authorities of medicine, Aesculapius, Dioscorides, Rufus, Hippocrates, Halley, Galen, Serapion, Rhazes, Avicenna, Averroes, John of Damascus, Constantine, Bernard, Gaddesden, and Gilbert. His knowledge is vast, yet Chaucer reminds us he cares more for gold than for God, making wealth his true medicine. Next, the unforgettable wife of Bath, Alison. And this figure featured in the exam. She is bold, experienced, and loves life. Chaucer tells us a good wife was there from beside Bath, but she was somewhat deaf, and that was a pity. And this physical disability was asked in exam. He praises her as a worthy woman all her life, again asked in exam. And most famously he notes she had had 5 husbands at the church door, and this has been asked in exam. She embodies both female independence and the joy of worldly living. Then we have the parson, the very opposite of corruption. Chaucer describes him as a good man was there of religion. Because of his good character, it was asked in exam. Though materially poor, he was rich in holy thought and good works. He preached Christ's gospel faithfully and lived it out himself. His words echo memorably, "If gold rust, what shall iron do?" Again it was asked in exam. In other words, if the gold become corrupt, what can be expected of ordinary laymen? The parson followed Christ's teachings first in life, then in words, and this was also asked in exam. His brother is the ploughman, a humble, hard-working farmer, simple in life yet rich in goodness. He works for the love of Christ and helps his neighbors without complaint, embodying the dignity of honest labor. Finally, the reeve, an estate manager who is shrewd and calculating. Outwardly efficient, he secretly steals from his lord while enriching himself. Chaucer paints him as clever but corrupt, feared by those beneath him, yet ingratiating to those above. Next, we have the miller. Chaucer paints him as a rough, brawny man who delights in breaking social order. We are told in the original lines, the miller was a stout fellow indeed, very strong he was, in muscle and bones. At wrestling, he would always win the prize. He was broad-shouldered, red-bearded, with a wart on his nose and a furnace-sized mouth. He carried a sword, told lewd tales, and even cheated by stealing corn. And yet he was merry enough to lead the pilgrims out of town, blowing loudly on his bagpipe. Quite the unruly, chaotic figure, symbolizing raw physical force and moral corruption. Next comes the summoner, a far more disturbing presence. He was the corrupt church official with a diseased, scarred face that frightened children. Chaucer's line makes it clear. A summoner was there with us in that place, who had a fiery red cherubic face, for he was lecherous, with narrow eyes. He reeked of onions, garlic, and strong red wine, and when drunk he would babble Latin phrases like quaestio quid juris. He easily took bribes, even excusing sins in exchange for wine or money, saying, "Purse is the archdeacon's hell." He knew the secrets of young women in the diocese and abused his position of power. In short, the summoner embodies the church's corruption, lecherous, greedy, and hypocritical. With him rode his companion, the pardoner. Unlike the summoner's brute force, the pardoner was sly and deceitful. He sold fake relics and indulgences, making profit out of people's faith. Chaucer describes him vividly. This pardoner had hair as yellow as wax, but it hung smooth like a hank of flax. He sang loudly in church, his voice strangely high and strong, while his sermons always ended with an appeal for money. Together, the summoner and the pardoner form a corrupt duo religion twisted into a business for lust and greed. Are very important for exams since Chaucer's Pardoner's Tale is a key text on hypocrisy and avarice. And then are very important for exams, Pardoner's Tale is a key text on hypocrisy and avarice. Finally, we meet the Manciple, a quieter but clever character. He worked as a provisioner for a temple of lawyers. Now, here's the irony. The Manciple himself was uneducated, but he was so shrewd in business that he outsmarted the very men trained in law. As Chaucer observes, in any case that might arise, and yet this Manciple outsmarted them all. He stands as a reminder that practical intelligence can easily surpass bookish learning. Together, these pilgrims represent different layers of medieval society, from brute force to cunning corruption. And Chaucer doesn't hold back in satirizing them. They add to the rich human comedy of the pilgrimage, where every vice, folly, and trick finds a place.